So, Samurai Sunday is a little different. No swords or anything like that. Since I got this book right here, it has some very interesting information in it. Some stuff that a lot of people I've seen other YouTubes can't. It's not that they can't figure out how it's used. It's just there's not much information on it, and this book actually touches on some stuff. So what we're going to talk about is samurai armor. Now, I saw a comment on another video, I think it's Matthew Jensen's. He was showing how you display armor, whatnot, and somebody commented, samurai armor is overhyped or something. I don't think it's overhyped. In fact, I don't think it's hyped up at all. I mean, it's armor to keep you from being killed, basically. So the armor developed, of course, over a period of time, just like in Europe, it all developed over time. It has its functionalities. It's made so you can move in it, you can ride a horse with it, things of that nature, just like European armor. Now, there are some other people who say, oh, the reason why the knots are tied in the front is because it shows a sign of war. I disagree with that. Even in Europe, same in Asia, everything has to do with practicality. Because if it's not practical, you're going to die on the battlefield. So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to war, everybody knows you're going to war. You know, you don't have to show a sign of it. So, how's the armor developed? Well, in the beginning, it was metal plates stitched together really, really tightly with silk. And I'll throw an image up right here of one. It's between 600 and 800 BC. So that's the time period for that armor. Was it useful? Yeah. For that time period, it was useful. They wore the armor in various different ways. Like that time period, you wore the armor on your shoulders. So all the weight sat on your shoulders when you fought. Now, as time went on, they found out, well, we should develop our armor a little bit better. The undergarments, like the sleeves that they put on. Let me see here. I know I have a picture of it in here. Hang on. But anyways, the undergarments would have little metal plates sewn inside of it. It's like a built-in chainmail. So it's harder to cut through. If anything, it might damage the edge of your bladed weapon, mainly polearm. The flaps that you see on the helmets that make it famous, and I have an image. I'll throw images up. Like this guy right here, as you can see, it's kind of rounded. Had reasons for that. It was to deflect arrows. Whether or not it worked, who knows? But that's why it was kind of radiused. It is for deflection. Now, a lot of armor, they had different types. They had the traditional samurai armor that we always see. Then they had something called tatami armor, which was metal plates, about yay big, sewn onto fabric, and it was very flexible chest piece. That was mainly for foot soldiers. foot soldiers had a variation degree of armor. If you had one with metal plates, you had the money for it. You're kind of a high-ranking soldier. If you could only afford a leather dough, which is the chest piece, that was heavily lacquered, one, for weather, it wouldn't rot as quickly, and two, it helps with slashes. So it doesn't slash through all the way. So they would, like, heavily, just thick leather, they would just heavily lacquer the hell out of it. That was really low ranking foot soldiers. So you've had very limited armor, depending on your rank as a foot soldier. And then, of course, the samurai class themselves had full-on body armor. And the body armor varied in style and whatever, so whatever the samurai wanted made, how they wanted it made. Now they have the shin guards. We've all seen the shin guards, which are these guys down here. Okay, big old shin guards. Now this is where the knots in the front come into play. Those shin guards were mainly for when you're riding horse. So, or excuse me, thigh guards. It was to protect your thighs while you're sitting there riding horse. You couldn't take a slash to the thigh. Okay? But on foot, because they're very long, they kind of go past the knee, it's going to be awkward to run in it. So what they would do, and all this is from my research, some web pages might say something different or whatever. If they're on foot, they had to fight on foot. Since the knot's in the front, they could untie it, drop it to the ground. Now they have more free reign of their leg movements without this heavy thigh guard flapping around on them. And it would kind of restrict their movement. Well, movement is everything in a battle. You have to be able to move freely. So on horse, they would worm. They got off the horse. A lot of them would untie it, since the knot's in the front, so they could drop it off. Hence the knots on a lot of the stuff that had to attach to their waist that would protect their legs or whatever. Not so much their arms, but anything that would restrict their leg movement, they could untie and just drop it. So that way, like I said, they had more free reign of movement. Now, as the centuries developed, hence the introduction of firearms, well, they kind of had to develop their armor even better, because that individual plating that was tightly woven with silk just isn't going to cut it no more. The little flintlock or matchlock rifle balls would just blow right through them, because with it being tightly woven, you can move your body and that plate's going to flex. So they had to develop a different type of armor, and how they did that was based off of European armor. Now the difference with the two armors was the armor that they developed from European armor, they made bulletproof. And I'll throw an image up right here of one. And it looks kind of weird because this is in the first stage developments of them developing it. So it's fashioned, I do believe, like a French or Spanish chess piece. That's why it looks like a European piece of armor. In the beginning, they were modeled after European, and then after a while, they incorporated their own style like they were used to. Story is that Oda Nobunaga was shot 3 times, and he survived all 3 times because his armor, it was a solid chess piece. So that's how you can see the development. If you go online, you'll see the development of the armor, where it was individual placed to a solid piece. The solid pieces, so if they were shot, they would live. Even their helmets, they developed them so if you got shot in the head, you wouldn't die. It'd probably knock you out, probably give you a concussion. Same with the chest piece. It probably knocked the wind out of you, maybe broke some ribs, but you were alive. So that just shows if that can stop a bullet, you're not going to be cutting your opponent or stabbing them very easily. Wearing that armor, it is going to be a trick in itself. Like the chest piece, the doe, had a lower piece to it all the time that was permanently attached to it. And that was to cover partial of your thighs, because as we all know, inside our inner thigh we have a major artery right there. And if you cut that artery, well, you're done. You're going to bleed out pretty fast. So they tried to protect all major points of the body. There's always gaps in armor. There has to be, otherwise you can't move. But yeah, they even developed their helmets to be bulletproof. And I'll throw an image up right here of one that's in a museum that has a bullet hole dent in it. So their armor, yeah, it's not, I don't think it's hyped up, but in the midst of things throughout their history, they had to develop it better and better and better, just like any culture, to withstand the different way of fighting. Otherwise, you wouldn't survive. And it depended on if you had the money to have that type of armor made. Like, Netflix has a documentary on the unification of Japan. I've only seen 2 episodes of it. The second episode I haven't finished. But they were doing a very well job of the historical unification. Some people had an issue with it. Where it showed Oda Nobunaga sitting down. They're not battling. It's just they're like executing the enemies who don't want to join forces with him. People say he's just sitting there, and that's not how they would sit without his helmet. He's got his armor on. And he's all, why don't they have the cheek pieces on? They would just at least have cheek pieces, because they do have a cheek piece. It came around here, and it protected your cheeks, okay? So it wouldn't go around the mouth, but it'd come around here right there. If you're not battling, why are you going to wear it? But people forget, Japan's very hot, very humid in the summertime. That's why they would shave their head a certain way. It was because not just it was fashionable for them, but wearing that helmet, you would sweat a lot and the heat would stay in with the hair, so they tried to keep it as cool as possible. That's why they did that. Second of all, not everybody had the cheek pieces made for their armor. Some felt they needed it, some didn't, some had the money for it, some didn't. So it all depended on the samurai's level of fortune that they had, and whether or not they liked it or they didn't like it. For all we know, Oda Nobunaga didn't feel he needed that. I mean, when you really read about him, he was pretty cocky. He, not to mention strategically a smart person, so he may have never had that cheek pieces. And if you're just sitting there interrogating your enemy, seeing if they want to take your side, why are you going to wear it? Because, well, if they don't, and they're tied up, you're just going to chop their head off. And if they're tied up, they can't hurt you. So Some people had an issue. It's actually a really good documentary. Some people had nitpicked it for these little tiny things, which were, to me, immaterial. Because, like I said, all that had to do with their fortune. How much money they had, whether or not they liked it, they didn't like it. Same with their swords. They chose what type of suba they wanted on it. What type of makugis they wanted. You know, or not makugis, manukis. In the handle, stuff like that. Whether or not they wanted a bohi, didn't want a bohi. All these things have to do with the person who wants it made. Okay, and then they make it to you. And it also depended if you had the money. Unfortunately, even back then, money played a factor. So, was samurai armor at the time, throughout their centuries, effective? Yeah, considering they weren't fighting outside foreign militant. They were fighting amongst themselves. So it worked perfectly fine for them. Now, granted, if they were fighting a foreign entity, obviously they would have developed stuff a lot quicker, because the bulletproof armor didn't come about until late 15th century on up. So that just shows how long it took them, because that's really when firearms were introduced to the battlefield. So prior to that, it wasn't a problem. So like all cultures, they develop their things as they go along throughout history. It's like the Uchi Katana. Everybody thinks, well, I think they could have improved on it more. They could have done this, they could have done that. Well, what they forget is it worked for them during those time periods because they weren't fighting other people. They were fighting themselves. So there was no need for them to sit there and I can improve it better. And they could have done this, they could have done, they didn't. To them, it was perfect. You know, that's the thing people forget. To them, what they developed was perfect for them. Because, like I said just a few minutes ago, they were fighting themselves, not a foreign entity. So I always hate that argument, well, that I don't think they perfected it. Well, you're talking about nowadays modern technology. We're talking about historically. To them it was. That's what they had. That's what they had to work with. You know? So, yeah. We can't say, oh, it's not perfect. I can make it. That's like trying to say, I'm going to reinvent the wheel. It doesn't work. So, yeah, I don't think their armor is hyped up. I don't think people hype up their armor. It's armor. It did its job in the time period that they needed it. It worked as a safeguard. Was it 100%? No. No, it wasn't 100%. Just like European armor wasn't 100%. It was enough to keep you alive. If you dented it good enough, it was going to make it difficult for you to move around, yes. Could you chop somebody's limb off while they're wearing their armor? No, you couldn't. You had to find gaps in it, just like European armor. You had to find the gap in the armor. That's why Europeans, a lot of European swords have a point. So, and it's really tapered at the end, so you could get into the gaps and stab somebody. Because you're not slicing them, you're not chopping them. Hence why warhammers in Europe were so prevalent. Because they knew if they dented that armor, well, you're going to be restricted now and you can't fight as much. Okay? Or, you know, warhammer with the spike, try and pierce the armor with the spike. It's the same thing with Japanese armor. You have to find the gaps in it. They would even have try and make armpit protection, because even in European armor, that's a weak point. You know, because you can't have nothing there. You can't move your arm up and down, so that was a weak point right there. Like I said, the inner of your thigh, got to protect that. The back of the legs, just like European armor on Japanese art, was open. So if you get behind them and slash the back of their legs, I mean, it's going to hurt. Even their hands, they would have metal plates on the back of their hand, not so much their finger, on their hand, and a little metal plate near the thumb in their gloves or whatever. Anything to protect your body, you know. So I think it's kind of neat that they developed an armor, and I'm sure they did in Europe, that would stop a musket ball. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I mean, because we look at, you take Asian culture and European culture during these times where they wore armor, and then take the Civil War. No armor whatsoever. All of history, previously, they knew when they went on the battlefield, we got to put some protection on or we're going to die. And then you take something like the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, nobody's wearing any protection. I don't know, I haven't looked into this, but I don't even think in World War II people wore protection. Then after that, we're all making body armor. It's like they went, hey, you know what? You know what would be useful so we don't die as much? Body armor. Even though in past history, everybody wore it. It was just a little bit heavier. Now, like I said, the older style of armor, you wore on you bared the weight on your shoulders. Now, when we get into the armor that is bulletproof, obviously the do, the chest piece, is a lot heavier. So that big, thick belt, if you look at armor, has a really thick belt. It's like that thick. Okay. Well, the older armor, you would wrap around your waist so it didn't dig into your hips because you're bearing all the weight on your shoulders. Well, now, when you tie it, you cinch it in a little bit more. So what the dough, when it rests, the dough rests on that big, thick belt and takes the weight off your shoulders. So it's reversed now. Because if you're bearing all that weight, it's going to be harder to move your arms up and down. Because it's basically like almost cast iron or whatever that they were using. So it's kind of interesting. One, you wear it on your shoulders, and then when it's a solid piece, your hips bear all the weight and take the weight off your shoulders. So this is how they developed pretty much their armor. It was trial and error, you know, just like any other culture. Wish I had reproduction armor. It'd been a lot more easier to show, but that stuff's expensive. So, but like I said, it was made so you could move in it real easily, just like European armor. I wouldn't say they're identical, because the Japanese armor, they liked it to be very lavish, you could say. You know, whereas European armor, they weren't too much involved in that, making it really spectacular and lavish. It was just, I need to protect myself. Whereas in Japan and other Asian cultures, they really decorated it to make it look, to show their status, basically. And on top of it, the materials that they had to work with. You know, they had silk to work with, bamboo, iron, which wasn't the greatest. Their iron is very poor there. In wood. Oh, leather. So it's not like they had a ton of resources, because they didn't. I read somewhere like traditional European armor at one point was only 1/16 thick. Because obviously once you start getting thicker, it gets heavier. But still, I mean, if you hit that with a sword, you're not going to get through it. Maybe probably an arrow, yeah, but a sword, no. And the way European armor is made differently, so it deflects things. I don't know. I haven't looked into much to European armor. So that's Samurai Sunday today, guys. The Japanese armor and what it was capable of doing. As soon as I can, this talks about in here one weapon that a lot of people have a hard time with, and that's the Nagamaki. This actually talks about what it was actually developed for. So as soon as I get a Nagamaki, I will let everybody know what it was actually developed and designed to do. But other than that, I hope everyone's having a good Sunday, and we'll talk to you later.